Hello, welcome to the Historian channel. Leave your like right on Kana and activate the bell to stay on top of all the fascinating stories of our planet. That's it, so let's go. Our studies of the East have often been conducted through a lens that does not provide us with genuine or truthful information about its history. If we examine the ancient history of Indian territory, very few, if any, know of the Harappan civilization or the Vedic civilization. In Italy, for example, these civilizations are scarcely studied in schools. Until recent years, history books contained only a few lines on the subject. However, these civilizations were fundamental to the development of those that followed. The Harappan civilization, which dates back to around 3000 to 2500 BC, was immense. To date, around 1,056 archaeological sites have been discovered, mainly in Pakistan, making excavation and investigation challenging. Yet, since its rediscovery in the mid-19th century, it has become evident that the Harappan civilization was vast. While the Sumerians around 2500 BC had a population of approximately 300,000 to 400,000 inhabitants, the Harappan civilization was believed to have around 5 million people. Over the last century and a half, we have learned that the Harappans were highly skilled navigators and traders who established significant cities, such as Mohenjo-Daro, which in 2500 BC had a population of about 100,000, comparable to a modern city like Istanbul, which has over 20 million inhabitants today. The level of expertise within this civilization was truly remarkable. The question that arises is, where did this civilization originate? Archaeologists are still uncertain, as it appeared almost out of nowhere around 4000 BC. In 3500 BC had its evolution, and then between approximately 2000 and 1700 BC disappeared. We don't know what happened to it, at least on an official level there are some hypotheses, but it disappears completely, and a few centuries later, about 400 to 500 years later, the real history of India will begin with the Vedic civilization, taking a small step backwards. However, to understand how much we do not know the history of these territories, if we move for a moment to present-day Pakistan and Balistan, which is that mountain range between Pakistan and Afghanistan, we find that there are some settlements. One of the most important, if not the most important, is called Mir, which are dated by official archaeology to 8,500, if not 9,000 BC, and the urban structure is obviously much smaller. The social urban structure of this city or of these cities in Balistan totally calls the history and the evolution of the subsequent Valinda civilization. This makes us understand how. In those territories, not only there are myths similar to more Western myths, such as the myth of the flood of the Old Testament, we also find it in those territories, but how there is an untold story, a story yet to be discovered, a story that delves into eras even more remote than what we all perhaps studied and learned about in school. The Egyptians date back to 3,300 BC, the Sumerians supposedly 4,300 BC. Among other things, there was an important of the Sumerian religion, even of the aristocracy, probably from his point of view, could have come from the Valinda civilization. So this civilization to most people could be one of, if not the oldest in human history, and has yet to reveal almost everything about its history. Consider, for example, that its writing still remains undeciphered, and this writing was already seen at the beginning of the 20th century to be very similar, if not identical, to the Rango writing of Easter Island, which is at least 18,000 kilometers away. There are also genetic analyses carried out in 2013 in Germany at the Max Planck Institute that demonstrated that in northern Australia, there are some Aboriginal tribe populations that have genetic markers that come directly from the civilization, so around 2,300, 2,400 BC, and we are talking about more than 4,000 years ago. Someone reached the north of Australia by boat, and this should make us understand how much we don't know about human history. We know only a small fragment of the history that concerns us, and if I may say, it is almost always filtered through the eyes of the West. However, there is still a lot to discover. The incredible thing is that these ancient civilizations can also explain how they were born from nothing, already advanced and progressive. The Vedic civilization is one such example, with its urbanization, social systems, and laws and regulations that we know very little about. Yet it was already advanced and evolved when the first traces of the Harappan civilization appeared in India. Here, a whole series of traditions can be inserted, not only of a religious and mythological nature, which concern the subsequent Indian peoples. who are obviously a continuation of the Vedic civilization, but they also tell us about beings they refer to as divinities. These beings, they clearly state, came from other planets and manifested themselves in northern India with the role of bringing civilization and teaching culture. For example, they imparted the rudiments of agriculture and astronomical observation. We often judge these themes and subjects with profane eyes, viewing them as mere mythology or legends created by these peoples to justify everything that came afterward. In reality, if we broaden our gaze to include China, the Sumerians, and the Egyptians, we see that many civilizations on Earth, since the most remote times, have spoken of these civilizers, divine beings who appeared at a certain moment to bring knowledge that would improve humanity and advance it to higher, more sophisticated levels. The Sumerians had the Abalu, beings who were half men and half fish. During the day, in the earliest eras of their myths, they would emerge from the water and teach astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, and irrigation to the Sumerians. Then, in the evening, the myths recorded on uniform tablets tell us that they would return to the water. For a long period, they assisted humans in the governance of earthly matters. We find similar accounts in China, where figures like Fuxi and Nuwa are also linked to the Chinese flood. This theme also appears in South America, as well as in India, with a whole series of deities and characters who had the same purpose. Over the centuries, and I would even say millennia, Indian philosophy, mythography, and mythology have become embellished with tales of divinities who came or manifested themselves out of love for a man or a woman. Thus, there are also these stories. However, if we read the Rig Veda or other texts of Indian antiquity, such as the Upanishads, we will find a wealth of knowledge that sheds light on these ancient beliefs and their significance. And many others demonstrate that there is a component of these texts that certainly belongs to a specific people and tells their story. However, there is also a whole series of data, details, and information that escape our understanding today. Through the eyes of modern individuals, we could say that these are technological and scientific data that these peoples absolutely could not have possessed unless some advanced individual had provided them with this knowledge, or they had instruments or machinery capable of allowing them to perform certain calculations. For example, I speak of the calculation of the speed of light, which was determined in ancient times in India by Canada, who, well before the Greeks, theorized the existence of atoms. He proposed that all creation is composed of these elements, microscopic particles that gradually aggregate to create matter. If we read the Bhagavata Purana, we see that it is clearly stated within these texts that we live in a universe, but there are infinite universes. According to one of the most important traditions, Vishnu created infinite parallel worlds when the world we know was formed, entering each of them to bring life. This shows how, in the Indian worldview, there are concepts from the most remote antiquity that we have only acquired centuries or even millennia later. In many cases, these concepts emerged between the 1600s and 1700s AD with the Enlightenment movement, leading to technological progress and advanced tools. Another fundamental fact is that in texts such as the Padma Purana, as well as in many other texts, even in the Rig Veda, it is stated that for the Indian worldview, particularly what would later become Hinduism, the question of whether the cosmos is inhabited does not arise. The cosmos is inhabited. What we call planet Earth is just one of an infinite number of planets that host life, obviously in various forms. In the Padma Purana, it is even said that in our galaxy alone, indicating that the concept of a galaxy existed in ancient India, which they referred to as Shishimara, there would be 400,000 species similar to humans. These beings could be taller or shorter, with blue, green, or any color of skin. This concept existed long before the Greeks, who also hypothesized about the possibility of an inhabited cosmos. However, the assertion that there are at least 400,000 species similar to humans is truly incredible. The Padma Purana was put into written form around 800 BC. First of all, it is easy to make such statements today. It may seem almost banal. However, let's try for a moment to put ourselves in the perspective of that era. At that time, these ideas were nothing short of impossible to conceive. There was no way of reasoning similar to the modern one, which is the result of scientific advancement and knowledge. At that time, The idea that the lights we see in the sky are stars, and that these stars could metaphorically have planets close to them, which could also be inhabited, was something disconcerting in the ancient Indian world. Nonetheless, this concept exists, and we find it in what would later become their sacred texts. As it was yesterday, so it is today. Unfortunately, due to a relativism that is leading to the loss of this type of tradition, this knowledge is diminishing in India as in other cultures, such as the Druids. Knowledge, which in Sanskrit is called Veda, was transmitted only orally and monastically from master to disciple. This knowledge was conveyed in very particular, codified ways to prevent alteration of the concepts. It was passed down from master to disciple, from mouth to ear, as has always been done over the centuries. Then, for a variety of reasons, especially with the birth of Buddhism in the 5th and 6th centuries BC, these texts began to be put into written form. However, the Indian world asserts that this knowledge is a heritage they have possessed for thousands of years. They claim, for example, that yoga is more than 6,000 years old. They also say that before this civilization in which we live, there have been at least 4 other civilizations that were destroyed for one reason or another, and that they are the survivors of the last civilization, having preserved some of this knowledge and integrated it into the current civilization. This isn't so strange because if we consider the Manusmriti, the laws of Manu, which is one of the texts that speaks of the Indian flood, it clearly states how Manu, their Noah, builds a boat following a series of events and saves specific figures, the 7 wise men, the Saptarishi, who must preserve knowledge. Manu also saves seeds, plants, and other men and women. And these figures will become those who recreate civilization when the waters recede. Here, too, the curious thing is that in the Indian world, these events are placed in a specific historical period that approximately corresponds to our 10,000 BC. This is an interesting historical period because it is around this time that Göbekli Tepe in Turkey was covered. Göbekli Tepe is considered the oldest temple of humanity. Paleoclimatology, therefore official science, tells us that the last glaciation ended in this historical period, which means the enormous mass of ice that covered much of the northern part of the planet, in some cases reaching 2, if not 3 kilometers in thickness, began to recede. Here's a reformatted version of your text with proper punctuation. As the ice melts, this enormous quantity of water pours into the seas, obviously raising the sea level. In India, for example, this led to an increase in marine levels of between 120 and 140 meters. In other areas of the planet, it was less, around 70, 90, or 100 meters. On one hand, this explains what could be the genesis of the various flood myths that we find all over the world. There have been more than 650 recorded to date. On the other hand, it can justify many traditions about a flood and also support the possibility of a civilization preceding ours, with technological knowledge and wisdom that could be considered much more advanced than what we have believed until now. All this, however, does not exclude other texts that discuss beings or deities. Some of these are the Adithirs and the Kumas, who, according to Indian traditions, were beings that came to our planet, to bring teachings. These teachings could be more technical, focusing on practical civilization aspects like irrigation and construction, or they could be more spiritual, aimed at elevating the people who receive them. The Indian world is full of these figures. It is important to note that the Indian deities are called devas, and the term deva in Sanskrit literally means enlightened being. This implies that a superior being is enlightened not only by spirituality, but also by knowledge. Such a being teaches what we might define as an inferior being, the people of ancient India, what the right paths are to follow in order to evolve in a non-self-destructive manner. The Indian epics also tell us how there were good devas and bad devas, how they fought each other, and how these dasas, these deities, like those of many other peoples, had to use means of transport to travel or wage war. These means of transport, or vehicles, are called Vimanas. Today, we could compare these Vimanas to flying vehicles used not only by humans, but to a much lesser extent by the devas to move around our planet and, as they say, from location to location, therefore, from planet to planet. These conceptions may seem absurd to us modern men of science, who must verify everything. However, if we examine the Indian sacred texts, their epics, philosophies, and religions, we can find many references to these Vimanas. Up until 10 to 15 years ago, the existence of these Vimanas was often questioned, dismissed as mythographic constructions akin to Apollo's chariot that flew in the sky. Then a whole series of texts were rediscovered that detail these Vimanas. It is worth noting that we possess barely 5% of the knowledge from the Indian world that has been translated into English or German, which means that a staggering 95% remains unexplored. What remains, either in Sanskrit or as an oral tradition not yet put into written form, is a world, a universe, that is truly waiting to be discovered. However, some of these texts are particularly emblematic. One that comes to mind is the Samarang Sutra, a text from 1051 to 1052, commissioned by a Maharaja, specifically a great ruler named Bhoja. Concerned that the knowledge of his kingdom was slowly being lost, he began sending emissaries throughout his realm to transcribe and preserve this knowledge. The result is a book that can still be found today, translated into English, known as the Samarang Sutra. What is curious about this text is that it is primarily focused on architecture. In the 32nd chapter, which spans more than 140 pages, it describes how, in the most ancient times of India, there were aircraft that flew like birds and moved through the sky, as well as beyond what we would define as the atmosphere. This atmosphere, referred to differently in the text, reveals a concept that is surprisingly modern, namely, the existence of various levels of atmosphere surrounding our planet, leading to what we call deep space. This text discusses the atmosphere as early as 1051 AD, mentioning aircraft that could also be equipped with certain types of weapons for battle. However, the Samarang Sutra specifies right at the beginning of this chapter that not all information can be provided to the reader. Some of this knowledge could be extremely dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands, potentially generating death, destruction, and wars if misused. Therefore, the author who transcribed this knowledge selectively provided the most emblematic and interesting parts of it. About 15 years ago, a group of Indian university professors began to question whether some of this highly technical knowledge was genuine. Partly for fun and partly out of curiosity, they aimed to investigate. One of these professors, Professor Shayan, who was then a professor of nanotechnology at the University of Bombay and later became principal before retiring, attempted to reconstruct one of the various machines described in the Samarang Sutra. Using cutting-edge tools for that period, he accurately followed the description in the book. What he discovered upon recreating the Chumak Mani, the machine he had chosen to examine, was rather disconcerting. He realized that what he had created was a solar panel, a liquid photovoltaic cell. This means it was a liquid that, when subjected to agitation and sunlight, generated electric current. This realization, especially from a text dated 1051 AD, is nothing short of futuristic. It is worth noting that liquid solar panels do not exist today. The first ones were tested and built in Japan around 1971 to 1972. Thus, we have a text that is nearly 1,000 years old. Here's the rewritten text with proper formatting and punctuation. This text technically presents a procedure for reconstructing something that, perhaps today, we would barely be able to recreate. In my opinion, this serves as solid proof that this culture, this people, and this reality, of which we perhaps know more on a spiritual level, had and possesses a wealth of truly cutting-edge knowledge. Other examples of materials based on or recreated from these ancient texts include what we would today define as stealth materials, which are capable of being invisible to radar, very lightweight, and at the same time, highly resistant. One of the most famous texts in this regard is known as the Vimanas Shastra. This text has faced contestation since it was written, but especially in the last 20 years. Critics have often claimed that Subbarao Shastri, the Brahmin who popularized it, was either a scam artist or merely trying to make money. In reality, he died very poor and was the last in an initiatory chain, with historical evidence supporting this claim. He dictated a series of knowledge to his adopted son, who was also his disciple, and this son transcribed it into 24 notebooks, which still exist today in southern India. The Vimanas Shastra is not channeled knowledge, as has often been suggested, but rather a text that is part of an initiatory chain transmitted from mouth to ear. Additionally, The Vimanas Shastra has served as a source from which technologies and various innovations have been derived in the last 10 years. Among other things, there are scientific publications, some of which I have also contributed to, and patents filed in India, Germany, England, and the United States that draw precisely from these texts. Unfortunately, this information is rarely discussed and remains in obscurity. Many questions arise regarding the Vimanas. What were they? How did they work? What could they do? From what has been reconstructed through various texts, we know that at least 59 different types of Vimanas are listed. Some of these could carry only 2 people. An emblematic legend is that of the Mercury brothers, who were 2 twin brothers that saved an individual about to drown in the sea. They took their Vimana, a small vehicle that could only hold 2 people, and flew to the middle of the ocean to rescue him. They placed him as safely as possible in their Vimana and then returned home, thus saving his life. There are also other Vimanas, such as the one Rama uses in the Ramayana. At the end of this epic poem, it is referred to as a flying palace, allowing Rama to transport his entire army, which was estimated to comprise a few hundred individuals, if not more. The description provided indicates a very wide variety of Vimanas, at least 59 different types, which according to Indian tradition existed in very ancient times. By very ancient times, we refer to periods before recorded history as we know it today. The Indians themselves state that these aircraft ceased flying around 3000 to 4000 BC. However, the events recounted in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are considered much older, dating back to 10,000 BC or even earlier. It is interesting to observe how attempts have been made to recreate these technologies, with varying degrees of success. Often, the information is partial, and we may lack the knowledge to fully comprehend what the text describe, as certain elements might be referred to in ways that differ from our contemporary terminology. Nevertheless, in many cases, we have succeeded in recreating intriguing technologies. A common question arises: would we be able to reconstruct a Vimana? Officially, no pieces of Vimanas or similar artifacts have been preserved that we are aware of. However, I believe that having access to texts, even those from as recently as 1000 AD, some of which are much older, provides evidence of the knowledge these people have preserved. These texts recount specific stories and detail levels of expertise and technical knowledge that today we could only achieve in certain cases. For me, this serves as both indirect and direct proof of the knowledge that has been handed down over time. Alongside this knowledge, there are also the deities linked to these accounts, figures who allegedly arrived on our planet and often fought among themselves. The Vimanas could be equipped with weapons, including very deadly ones. Generally, the weapons of the Ganas are referred to as Tasastra. Here, Astra means weapon, while Ta can be translated as energy or fire. It also represents the inner fire that a practitioner of Indian disciplines feels when they are on the brink of awakening. Thus, Tasastra literally means energy weapons, encompassing all that this term may imply. In the Mahabharata, arguably the greatest and oldest epic poem in human history, we find accounts of the last 18 days of a battle fought between 2 rival factions who were fundamentally related. The Pandavas are depicted as the good guys, while the Kauravas are labeled as the bad. Arjuna, the central figure of this poem, receives guidance from Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, a portion of the Mahabharata in which Krishna imparts teachings to Arjuna, including those related to yoga. There is also a part of the Mahabharata that describes how Arjuna is taken from the battlefield, carried aboard a Vimana. He recounts his experience, stating, "I see the Vimana rising, going higher and higher, and observes how the elephants used in battle appear as small as ants. His vast army transforms into an indistinct expanse of colors and shapes." Arjuna describes how the Vimana leaves our planet and travels through what we would define as space until it arrives in the artificial city known as Indraloka, the city of the god Indra. Once inside, Arjuna shares that he sees tens of thousands of Vimanas entering or leaving Indraloka or stationed nearby. Reading this, one might feel as if they are immersed in a science fiction novel or film. However, this narrative originates from the extremely ancient Mahabharata, which dates back at least to the 3rd or 4th century BC, though it is rooted in an earlier oral tradition. Upon entering Indraloka, Indra provides Arjuna with weapons and instructs him on how to use them. Without proper training, these weapons could be deadly in the hands of the wrong person, posing a threat not only to Arjuna but also to his army. This scenario presents parallels to modern times, where one must learn how to handle a rifle or launch a missile. Clear comparisons to today's technology. Arjuna learns to use these tastras and returns to battle, ultimately winning the war. These traditions and stories, at least personally, differ significantly from the tale of the Trojan horse or other Nordic myths, which contain intriguing elements. However, the Mahabharata features a technological component that I firmly believe existed. It suggests that behind these accounts lies a procedure, technology, or science that would have been unimaginable in that era. It is akin to how the ancient Romans could not have envisioned the modern tablet or cell phone. Without having seen or understood such things, one cannot conceive of their existence. The Indian world is rich in these elements. While they may seem circumstantial, the abundance of such evidence, at least for me, points to genuine proof at the level of drawings and descriptions. Sculptures, however, provide very few elements. The Vimanas are represented only a handful of times in the temples of that era. When depicted, the Vimana is shown as a flying temple or a flying cart. In southern India, there is a series of beautiful frescoes in various cities, including Puri, where one can see Vimanas represented as two overlapping discs, reminiscent of the flying saucers described in the 1940s and 1950s, with some spheres underneath them. These frescoes, located near Puri, are dated back to at least 1400 to 1500 AD, presenting a form that is entirely impossible and incomprehensible for that time and place, as well as in other parts of the world. Another interesting fact is that the Samarang Sutra, an architectural text discussing Vimanas, tells us about the concept of Vastu. Vastu is Indian architecture, which inherently carries a religious and spiritual component. Therefore, Vastu is not merely the art of constructing a temple, house, or palace. It is designed according to specific standards and proportions that embody strong spiritual teachings. The Samarang Sutra and Vastu in general indicate that, particularly in southern India, the uppermost part of a temple, which usually has a disc-shaped appearance, is architecturally referred to as the Vimana. This term designates the pinnacle of the temple, connecting the earthly realm of humanity with the divine realm. This understanding shows how certain knowledge has also permeated everyday fields, such as architecture. Additionally, there are countless legends concerning the Vimanas, often attributing technological aspects to various deities. For example, Shiva is sometimes depicted using a Jat Linga, which is described as a cone of fire or light that envelopes him and transports him to his celestial spheres. This interpretation has led many scholars and researchers to examine these elements from a technological perspective. Numerous small pieces of information seem to converge to create a broader, more extensive picture, suggesting that ancient India, as well as regions in the Far East, possessed knowledge that is difficult to comprehend today. This knowledge could possibly be viewed as a heritage from a previous civilization. In some cases, they assert that this knowledge was a cultural inheritance bestowed by these deities upon various sages and wise men who had the good fortune to encounter them. In my opinion, this highlights a significant difference between cultures, not to imply they are entirely different, but to illustrate two distinct approaches to life: philosophy, spirituality, and religion. For example, consider the Dalits, often referred to as the untouchables. It's evident that in India, they have the will to improve their living conditions, but they will never make the effort that a Westerner would. According to their religion, they believe that if they were born into the lowest caste, it means they deserve their karmic debt due to extremely negative actions and gestures in past lives. Therefore, they feel that while they can improve their situation, it is pointless to try too hard. This concept contrasts sharply with the Western mindset, where if someone finds themselves in a disadvantaged condition, they will do everything in their power, honestly or dishonestly, to survive and improve their circumstances. In my opinion, there are two distinct ways of approaching life: philosophy and religion. It is difficult to generalize, but for example, in ancient Egypt, there was a priestly caste that held power for thousands of years, at least 2,000 years. Then we have Akhenaten, who attempted to create a monotheistic cult that focused on a single deity instead of many. His images were destroyed, and his figure was effectively erased from history. Regarding the Jewish faith, which is not my area of expertise, Jewish texts refer to Elohim. Some interpret this in the singular, while others in the plural. I will leave that debate to those who specialize in translations and the nuances of the faith. However, it is a fact that the Old Testament also mentions other deities. In the Indian context, the situation is quite different. For instance, we do not find a singular myth of creation in Indian tradition. Sumerians, Egyptians, Jews, and Christians have a god who shapes clay and creates life. In contrast, in Indian belief, humans have always existed, transitioning from civilization to civilization, and were never created except in very remote times, merely by the thought of the Supreme Being, who by thinking created man. There are many other myths in this tradition. A common misconception about Hinduism is to define it as polytheism, where many deities are worshipped. In reality, Hinduism can be described as henotheistic. Deities like Shiva and Ganesha are viewed as different manifestations of the same Supreme Being, expressed in approximately 33 million different forms. Hinduism is divided into 6 darshanas or schools of thought, which include an atheistic school and what we could define as a hyper-religious or hyper-bigoted school. There are 6 main philosophical visions in the Indian worldview. Therefore, we encounter a rich and complex tradition that differs significantly from what is generally known about Hinduism, unless we approach it with a very academic or serious perspective. The text painstakingly helps us understand these differences. It is difficult to compare the East and West as Jenin did, because they are 2 distinct worlds, much like how the color of morning is perceived in Japan as white while for us it is black. Sometimes there are significant links and points of contact. Other times there are not. But this is also the beauty of the differences about the planet we live on. Another extremely interesting text is the Surya Siddhanta, which is considered the oldest astronomical text in human history. It is said to contain information dictated by the sun god to ancient sages in India. The incredible aspect of this text is the extensive series of data, elements, and knowledge that we find within it. First and foremost, it provides a measurement of the Earth with a very low margin of error, which closely aligns with measurements performed at the beginning of the 20th century. It also describes the Earth as a spherical planet and discusses the universe, our galaxy, and the concept of many thousands of Shishima. Thousands of galaxies that together form an extremely vast universe, almost impossible to imagine and understand. Perhaps one of the most fascinating details, which has been analyzed and studied over the last 30 to 40 years, but is still relatively unknown, is what the Surya Siddhanta says about the routes that deities took in our part of the galaxy to reach our planet. The first scholar to analyze this data was David William Davenport. Born in India as the son of Lord Davenport, a landowning family, he was proficient in 14 languages, including Sanskrit and Hindi. He lived for many years and died in Rome, Italy, in 1984. Davenport studied the Surya Siddhanta in great depth, and I have his diaries containing various transcriptions of this ancient astronomical text. He realized that beyond the stylistic anthologies, including poetic and religious elements, the text clearly stated that one divinity, rather than another, needed a Vimana, a means of transport, to arrive on our planet. This insight highlights how concrete these figures could be. Moreover, the vehicle was described as needing to make long journeys and travel along routes in the galaxy to reach our planet. The Surya Siddhanta lists a series of star systems, employing a very modern concept of habitable planets that existed alongside various suns. Many of the deities we know of in India are said to have originated from these systems. The area known as Mara Shiras, which translates to the head of the antelope in Sanskrit, is an asterism, a group of stars that may contain planetary systems, located near the constellation of Orion. As we have learned, Orion was fundamental for various civilizations, including the Egyptians, Australian Aborigines, South American cultures, and even the Sumerians. All these cultures tell us how some of their divinities, if not the most important ones, originated from the Orion area. Additionally, the Surya Siddhanta, in Davenport studies and in more recent analyses, identifies an area near Mara Shiras with a system that has a very particular name, Ara. In Sanskrit, Ara has two meanings: green and, more broadly, humid or wet. Davenport, the first to suggest this, believed that this solar system might contain a planet capable of supporting life. Incredibly, we have been mapping and registering exoplanets for almost a decade now. These include rocky planets that orbit stars, some of which may have atmospheres and possibly even liquid water. Recent analyses and data from the last 2 to 3 years indicate a strong probability of solar systems with planets positioned just right to maintain liquid water, thereby potentially hosting and sustaining life. Remarkably, all this information is found in the oldest astronomical text in human history. While these are hypotheses and inferences, speculative theories, they are clear, precise pieces of information in a text that dates back at least 2,000 years. This raises the question: how did they possess such advanced knowledge in such ancient times? Another curious fact is that these divinities are said to travel along specific routes in our galaxy, with various star systems indicated as having habitable planets. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect is that there are points on this map, recreated on paper by Davenport, where the Surya Siddhanta describes gates or passages for the Vimanas. According to the Surya Siddhanta, a Vimana traveling from distant regions approaching Earth or other areas of interest could, in certain cases, enter these gates or passages. Once inside, it would embark on a long journey through the galaxy. Less time, and obviously, here we can draw a comparison with the modern world. It resembles what, for example, Star Trek and many other science fiction films have introduced us to: the warp drive and the distortion of space-time. As of 2023, we understand that this type of technology is theoretically possible, and it may even become practical in the future when we develop the necessary technology. However, today we are unable to create it. It is merely an extension of Einstein's relativity. Science and theory confirm this. We find unique data in the oldest astronomical text in history, where Vimanas, with various divinities on board, entered at one point and exited at another, covering enormous distances. This clearly indicates that within this text lies a hidden fragment, a grain of sand in a vast area that we still have yet to understand, comprehend, and study. For me, this serves as proof that these are not simply myths, legends, or creations made by an ancient poet, but that behind many of these texts and traditions lies a much more earthly and concrete background. Another very interesting myth in the Indian tradition is that of the 7 wise men, or Saptarishi. These 7 wise men are considered the civilizers of the Indian people. Tradition states that Manu, the Indian Noah, following a great flood, saved the seeds of plants, animals, men, and women. His main purpose, however, was to preserve knowledge, known in Sanskrit as Va, which refers to their sacred texts. To save this knowledge, he took the Saptarishi aboard his boat. After a long period of being tossed about, the ship finally lands on the Himalayan range as the waters recede. When the land becomes visible again, the wise men disembark and begin to move to restore civilization among the survivors, even in very distant areas. This myth, this tradition, and this legend are fascinating because they speak of a flood from a previous civilization and the recreation of a new one. For Manu, the laws of Manu dictated that these characters were real individuals, flesh and blood, who would later be deified for their fundamental role in restoring civilization to humanity. The curious aspect, however, is that we find this myth in many other areas of the planet, raising the question: is it legitimate for similar myths to exist across different cultures? Identical myths developing in different areas of the planet naturally raise questions, especially when these myths are mirrored and completely identical. For instance, if we look at the Sumerian civilization, we find the myth of the 7 Abalu. The 7 Abalu are considered the civilizers of Sumerian society. Tradition states that they arrived on board a luminous egg, described as descending into the sea, which then brought forth these beings. The Abalu are depicted in ancient tablets as having an anthropomorphic form, part man and part fish. These Abalu had the task of teaching the high dignitaries and rulers of ancient Mesopotamia the basics of civilization: how to irrigate fields, cultivate crops, perform agricultural rotation, observe the sky, and even the rudiments of mathematics. In fact, archaeological discoveries over the last 10 years have uncovered tablets inscribed with the foundations of mathematics, developed first by the Sumerians and later by the Akkadians. It is said that there were 7 wise men who brought civilization, and astonishingly, this tradition dates back to very ancient times, reaching as far back as 400,000 BC. At that time, humans were not even Homo sapiens yet. If we move to Egypt, we again encounter the 7 wise men, whose story is told in the Temple of Edfu. They are also regarded as the civilizers of Egyptian society. In Egypt, the timelines compared to our historical reckoning are very different. Their first dynasty is thought to begin around 3000 to 3300 BC with the Scorpion King, but earlier divine and semi-divine dynasties, known as the Nedu and the Shemsu, are also mentioned. The Nedu were gods who ruled over men. Numerous archaeological elements, including the papyrus of Pamo and the stele of Chin, support these narratives. We are discussing eras that are extremely ancient, in which, as they say, the deities walked among men. Similarly, in India, various traditions and historical accounts date back to at least 20,000 to 30,000 BC. While some may argue that these dates are improbable or that historical events have been retroactively placed in time, others may consider this perspective less skeptical. If we look at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which was buried around 9600 BC, we might conclude that an advanced civilization existed long before what we typically define as historical periods. Civilization may have actually existed 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. We also find the myth of the 7 wise men in various cultures, including the Chinese, Japanese, and South American. By connecting the dots, a narrative emerges of 7 figures who, for many peoples, were human, flesh and blood, but who were also extremely advanced and progressive. These figures were often deified and typically appeared after significant events, such as the end of the last glaciation and the event known as the Flood. Their role was to help recreate civilization by restoring knowledge and the essential elements necessary to start anew. This observation is both curious and fascinating, as it mirrors the approach of Heinrich Schliemann, who initially worked from the hypothesis that the story of the fall of Troy was not just a myth, but may have been based on a historical fact. After facing setbacks, he ultimately discovered the ancient city of Troy on Hisarlik Hill, as described in the Homeric poems. A similar pattern can be seen in the Indian world, where archaeological evidence supports their traditions, which contain technological and scientific knowledge that would have been impossible to acquire in such ancient times. In my opinion, this implies that someone more advanced, and perhaps not necessarily from this planet, provided their wisest and most knowledgeable individuals. The concepts of good and evil are relative. In Hinduism, the Devas are divided into 2 categories. The Devas, or good beings, and the Asuras, or bad ones. Interestingly, in Zoroastrianism, which originated in Afghanistan and Iran, the Asuras are regarded as the good deities, while the Devas are seen as the bad ones. This suggests that both groups represent opposing factions of the same reality. However, the distinction is nuanced. Devas and Asuras are fundamentally the same. The Asuras are deities with more material purposes. They are drawn to food, wealth, and earthly pleasures, while the Devas are more evolved beings who have diminished their material desires and dedicated themselves to higher pursuits. The relativistic nature of good and evil is evident in Hinduism, as well as in many other religions. It is essential to recognize the existence of evil to appreciate the concept of good. One cannot understand what good means without knowing its opposite. This dynamic is similar to the yin and yang philosophy, where the understanding of one aspect relies on the understanding of its counterpart. While wars and human atrocities are indeed abominations and represent extremes, the fundamental concepts of good and evil remain complex and intertwined. That is as simple as it is fundamental. There is a very interesting aspect found in many myths. Indian deities are not immortal, they can die. For instance, Krishna dies at the end of the Mahabharata after being struck by an arrow in his heel, marking the end of the previous Indian era, the Yuga, and the beginning of the current one, known as the Kali Yuga. According to Indian texts, his death occurred in 3102 BC, which is over 5,000 years ago. The Kali Yuga is said to last 432,000 years. Therefore, apocalyptic events like 2012 in the Indian worldview are in fact a long way off. Every Indian deity can die. They are beings described as flesh and blood who can be killed. The Asuras or Devas can be killed as well, but they possess a lifespan that is significantly longer than what we typically measure in our time. This extended lifespan is attributed to the use of certain substances, known as amrita or divine drinks, which are also found in many other cultures and are said to prolong life for an extensive period. Interestingly, according to Indian texts, one could distinguish a deva among men because they typically did not walk on the ground. Instead, they moved a few centimeters above it, and their bodies did not cast shadows. This peculiar detail appears in various traditions and civilizations across many religious schools of thought that developed later. These curious and somewhat anomalous characteristics may suggest that there is something true behind these stories. I believe that 10,000 to 20,000 years ago, there existed various realities on Earth. This is a personal opinion based on years of research. These realities might have been divided, each with its own sphere of influence. The myths are so diverse that they likely indicate the presence of different subjects in various regions, such as India in the East, as well as in Sumer in Egypt. It is also precarious to speak of a single mother religion or mother civilization. I believe there were other civilizations before ours, not necessarily Atlantis or Lemuria, but various realities that may or may not have interacted with one another. They might have even been in conflict. We cannot know for certain. My perspective on where this knowledge can lead us is focused on reacquiring something that is not inherently ours. While we are discussing Eastern civilizations, which are quite distant from our own, I think that through serious and thorough research, we could uncover a vital piece of our planet's history that might help us understand part of our origins. This knowledge could also aid us in improving ourselves as individuals. Just like in the West, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and many other epic poems from the East discuss wars, but they also contain teachings. The Mahabharata, for example, includes the Bhagavad Gita, which provides a profound examination of certain attitudes and lifestyles. It critiques the relentless pursuit of money and technological progress that characterizes our civilization, which often leads us to lose sight of what truly matters. The Bhagavad Gita, although not initially part of the Mahabharata, was incorporated around the 3rd century BC and serves as a pivotal point, offering essential religious and spiritual teachings not only for Arjuna, but for anyone who has read the text over the centuries. Where are we headed? Personally, I believe that returning to a genuine understanding of the East, not the commercialized version that is often presented to us today, featuring gurus who attract thousands in sports stadiums, can be beneficial. By simply engaging with Indian sacred texts and investing a little to acquire their ancient writings, we can regain a vision and a life path that may help us improve ourselves. It is clear that some individuals will wish to fully embrace this perspective and dive into it wholeheartedly. However, we live in a Western world, surrounded by numerous influences that may hinder our approach. Thus, I think the right balance lies in integrating that knowledge, which has many similarities to philosophies closer to us, while also recognizing the unique insights that Eastern wisdom can offer. This balanced perspective can lead us to explore more deeply who we are and who we aspire to become. Ultimately, rediscovering India and the East with an open mind, free from fanaticism and factionalism, may allow us to become better individuals and more enlightened spirits in today's world. And if karma exists, at least for those who believe in it, it suggests the possibility of reincarnation, guiding us through our cycle of lives towards a conclusion, toward moksha, or the return to the original source.